Easter Sunday he rode, on the Easter Sunday he rode, on the Easter Sunday he rode for me. One day when I was lost.
All right, so we're back, and today we're actually talking about Ernest Gaines as a Gathering of Old Men. With my background, of course, it doesn't show, but I'm joined today by Dr. Jennifer Morrison, who is at Southern University in New Orleans. I think this is our first semester teaching there, but we know each other from UL Lafayette, and we both worked at the Ernest Gaines Center. So we've worked on Ernest Gaines. Both of us have written on him, and actually met him and worked with him. To a certain extent. So she's going to be joining us today. The next week, of course, when we finish the book, Dr. Maria Aber-Leiter is going to be joining us too. She's worked on Gaines as well, and specifically with Cajun identity. So if we want to talk about that some today, but I'm, always glad to talk with you, Jennifer, about any of this.
Awesome. Okay, so let's get started.
Yeah, let's get going. We were talking a little bit before, of course, we started recording, but I just want to know, you reread this book, you said, and I told you earlier I was not planning to reread it, but I reread it and I kind of got sucked in because I realized again how good Gaines is as a writer. I don't think this is his best novel, even stylistically, but do you want to talk about that a little bit? Or I guess let's start there. I mean, what makes him so good and so special as a writer, I guess?
I think for me, I'm from South Louisiana. So, and I believe I've told you this story many times, but I was in 7th grade and a teacher handed me a Gaines novel.
Oh.
I was reading something like Danielle Steele or something low grade, right? And, she handed me that novel. I think it was Bloodline. So it was a collection of short stories. And I was just mesmerized because I responded very strongly to the fact that I recognized the people in the text. I'm not sure I had ever read a book that really, that I won't even say I saw myself in, but I saw my culture, right? Yeah. And because I was a young girl. So, I mean, there were things in Bloodline that were adult. And, obviously I couldn't necessarily relate to that. But I related to the people as a culture, as a part of like recognizing the setting and how the people talked and how they interacted with each other. And so for me, what Gaines does really well is he just nails a specific segment of the population, a specific area in the world to a T. And I think, that was his aim, to aim for that verisimilitude. But I mean, at the same time, there's a lot of artistry there, right? Yeah. So, in something like A Gathering of Old Men, I'm struck by like the narrative, the way he tells the story, which is basically a group of people are coming together to try to tell and to describe an event that happened. And when you think about, and you and I have talked about this many times before, but he, learned how to write by interacting with the people on the plantation that he grew up on. Yeah. And you see that in the story. And he also, when in his own words, he talked about how, people would want to write letters to people who lived in California and all these other places. And they had something to say, but it was only so much. And so he would add things and maybe not embellish, but he definitely would fill out the story. And
yeah, they'd give him like 2 or 3 sentences and he'd make it a page and a half.
He'd make it a page. And that's, that's how the storyteller's created. I think that's such an amazing story. But I think this is one of those stories. This is the novel where I can see that influence, where he, I'm just thinking about the way every character, when you're reading and really paying attention, how they have a distinct personality, a distinct point of view. And, the story is told by like, I want to say 10, 15 different people.
I don't remember how many.
Person has a completely unique and distinct perspective such that I was reading one chapter and the description of one of the characters was one way. And then I read another chapter and the way they described the same character, I was like, wait a minute. And then I was like, oh, right.
Do you remember who it was?
People. No, I actually don't. Because, I'm just thinking about that, but I'm trying to think. It'll come to me.
Well, I was just thinking when you said that, I was rereading T-Jack's section, which they're going to get to later. And I was like, he is racist through and through. Like, I don't think I ever noticed how racist his language was. in that section.
Wait, what's this again? I'm sorry.
T-Jack, the owner of the bar.
Right.
I was like, because I'd always focused, I think, on Marshall and kind of his not wanting the land and all of that. And I was really reading this. I was like, oh, I mean, not shocking to me, but I was like, you know, the way he does it. But what also, while you're talking and when I was reading Maria's essay too, the other thing that really stands out with them that they're going to really get into next week, of course, with the chapter where Sully and Gil go to see Fix. I mean, you have to realize at this point in what they're reading, Fix hasn't even shown up. We've just heard about it.
Right.
But they need to pay attention to that chapter because of the humanity that Gaines shows to not just the Black men who were gathered there, but to every character really in this novel. And I would say in all of his novels, they're going to read in Maria's piece, they talk about A Love and Dust. And she talks about how Bon Bon is presented with humanity, right? And he is. But what you're also saying too makes me think about these discussions we've been having in class with the last novel we read, Crousset's, I get the titles mixed up, My Home Among the Strangers, which focuses on a first generation. Have you read that?
I did not read that one. I read her. Wait, is that the series of essays?
No, that's My Time Among the Whites.
Yeah, I read that one. I didn't read
I taught that one, and that one's really good too. That's what led me to this novel.
Right. How was that? Was that good?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I want to read that one.
The novel centers around kind of semi-autobiographical about her that you get from the essays about her going to an Ivy League school, basically.
Right.
So it's kind of about that. But one of the things that it's centered around too is her being accused of plagiarism. So, and for incorrectly citing or accidentally not citing, basically. So she's in front of the academic, you know, integrity committee or whatever, about to get kicked out of school. I mean, there's that fear hanging over. But so I've had them read some things about plagiarism from Rebecca Moore Howard a couple of weeks ago, and then they read that novel. But I think about Gaines with that too. And when you're talking, you mentioned that it's multiple points of view, and he's very adamant about the fact that this book, and even Just Like a Tree and Bloodline, that collection, is modeled after Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, right? The multiple points of view. He's very adamant about the fact too that he always thinks of James Joyce's what's the name of the story? Ivy Day in the Committee Room, which is a boring story because it's just people sitting around talking about the death of somebody, about Parnell. But he talks about that and wanting to do that, and he does that with the tragedy of Brady Sims. You know, that the final novel I think is the epitome of that. And he talks about Hemingway and all these influences, and you see it, and he takes them and makes them his own. So I think for my students, that discussion of plagiarism, is that plagiarism? Is it imitation? Is it making its own? It's not plagiarism, I know that. But it leads into those discussions, right?
Well, I think one thing that I want to return to is when you talked about Fix and you said that Gaines humanizes him. I really think what's so fascinating about that is, and this is what for me makes Gaines like a really sophisticated writer. Like for me, a sophisticated writer, I mean, there's good writers and there's great writers, but sophisticated writers are people who, you know, they do really, really interesting things with the text that make you think, and you're not even anticipating it. And even when we're discussing Gaines, I'll talk about something and I realize, wait, he did that. And, you know, and so one of the things that he does is, like, I think about Fix, he's humanized through the lens of his, you know, his son's friend, right? But we don't get the perspective of him. Well, we get the perspective of him from the other Black characters. They've built him up to be this big bad, but, you know, they don't change their perspective of him as this big bad until he doesn't ride, right? And so they come to understand that Fix is no longer this, you know, hold on their community and on their psyches, because nothing happens to the person who murdered his son in the same way that it would have in the past. He's not able to extract the retribution that he would have been able to years ago when he was more powerful. But we come to understand Fix's vulnerability and his humanity. I guess if you want, I would call it vulnerability. Through the lens of his son's friend, who is not a member of the community, who does not share the community's prejudices and values. Like, he's an outsider.
Yeah, he's not connected to either side.
Right.
Or
He's
any of the three sides.
He's a complete outsider. And so it begs the question, can something like this novel do the work of rehabilitating a character like Fix? And I don't think it aims to, because we see that vulnerability and humanity through the lens of an outsider. And the people in the community, like, in thinking about the psychic hold of a person like Fix on that community, I don't know that, I think Gaines sort of like doesn't even think to address that directly, because it's Mapes who asks them, all right, what's changed to you, right? Yeah. What's progress to you? You guys are trapped in the past, but the reality is there is no confrontation with Fix. The confrontation is between the character who murdered Bo and Bo. And so you could argue, is there actually a humanizing of Fix? Sure, in a very specific way, but the idea of Fix, like, in reading it again, I was struck by how people just referenced Fix. Yeah. Like, it reminds me of sort of like, you watch those Marvel movies. I've been watching all these Marvel movies because I have nothing to do on the weekends and I need my mind, to be off serious stuff. And it's like this thing, that people, this big villain, right? This uber villain who people, have built up, and rightfully so, he's done horrible things, but he has this psychic hold on this community. And all they can think about is, that's Fix's son, that's Fix, he's gonna ride. And, I was so struck by that. And I was like, how do you humanize that character in a book like this when you know that the community is not there? And it's what you do is you create a character outside of the community who Fix allows himself, or who allows into his home and sees him in that vulnerable state. Because also another thing that Gaines skillfully does is clearly shows the lines of segregation and how the communities bump up against each other and intermingle with each other, but they're also very separate, like in their grieving, in their fear, like there's a separation. And so these people who are afraid of Fix are not ever going to see him mourning his son. And so they're not going to, in order to tell this wholesale comprehensive story, you cannot tell a story like this the way that Gaines has done, from the perspective of one character. Because honestly, when you tell a story in this way, where you get this cacophony of voices, it is not the story of one person, it's the story of a place, right? And so in that way,
Gaines does so well.
And you have to get Fix's sort of like a vision of Fix outside of the vision of him as this big bad villain, because you want to tell comprehensively the story of a place, but you cannot literally get to Fix through the lens of these characters, the Black characters in the plantation that live on the plantation, because they don't have access to him other than through his brutality.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that was such a wonderful, skillful way of threading a very fine, needle, like very, very skillful way of saying, okay, I know that I need to show this perspective. I have limited ways that I can do that. This is the way to do that without compromising the integrity of the story of all the characters. So I thought that was brilliant.
There's three things that stood out to me when you were saying that. And the first that I thought about, and I know they're not reading this text, and I'm trying to think if he does it in here, because one of the most masterful things that he does, I see him do in Of Love and Dust, and I see him do in A Lesson Before Dying, is where he's doing first-person narration, but he seamlessly moves to provide other voices,
right?
And you're not even realizing he's doing it. So, like when Jim Kelly's narrating Of Love and Dust, he'll move into, and I forget other characters' names, but I mean, he may move into Marcus's or he'll move into other members of the quarters, other residents of the quarters, into their kind of perspective, especially at the end when I think he brings in Sun Brown and everything like that. But he masterfully like weaves it in there, and you don't realize what he's doing until you actually kind of start thinking about it. And I think he does that some here, but I have to look more specifically at it. But the other thing that stood out as well is, of course, that they need to think about is whose voices do we get? I haven't thought about Sully being the outsider. If we get Gil in that situation, I mean, Sully even narrates it when Gil comes back, right? And he gets with Candy first, or confronts Candy first. But if we get Gil's, it's going to be different than if we get Sully.
Right.
But the other thing that stood out to me too that we need to talk about, and Maria talks about this. Louisiana is a very unique spot, and especially South Louisiana. I mean, I'm from North Louisiana, and we're different up there. You know, so we want to claim Cajun identity and South Louisiana identity, but we're not. We're East Texas and Mississippi and Arkansas, whatever. But it's very distinct, and it gets into that question too of what role does Fix play?
Right.
So even his name, what role does Fix play?
Well, I think he plays the role of, like, it's sort of like the psychic, you know, terrorism of that particular time period for Black people. You know, because in reading it again, I was thinking about the ways that vision we get of Fix as a man, as a grieving man, right? Who's also, you know, bound by his tradition and his ways, but also he can't behave in the ways he used to behave. Like, in order, like, he can't avenge his son. He has to let the law do it, which is fascinating because there's this section, and I'm not quite sure which character, one of the, you know, older Black men who says that, you know, my brother was murdered by, you know, Fix's people or people on the river, the Cajuns, and the law did nothing about it. And now Fix is bound by the law. And so we know that time has passed because, again, as I said before, this is a story about a place and about the passage of time. And so one thing that I think in A Gathering of Old Men that strikes me repeatedly is these men, that there's a tragedy there, and that these men are finding their voices and accessing their masculinity in ways that they were stymied from, unable to, you know, past the point. It's pretty much over for them. I mean, they're in their twilight years. It's one of those books that actually, say you were teaching a class on aging or the life cycle, this is that book that I would choose to teach about that stage where, you know, you're reflecting on your life, and you see a lot of reflections on these men's lives, and they're thinking, you know what? I'm going to be in the ground soon. I don't have much left. You know, I've lived my life. I want to take a stand. I want to do this. I want to assert myself. This is my way of getting or accessing my masculinity. And yet the way that I'm choosing to do so, you know, having this, you know, gathering together and not, you know, telling which one shot the gun or whatever, which one murdered Bo. You know, the way in which they're choosing to do it suggests that, you know, it's sort of over for them anyway. Yeah. I mean, and so there's something really.
They're like, I don't care if I come back. I mean,
they don't care if they come back. And yet at the same time, you know, they're not going to get that violent, young blood, young man's confrontation because Mapes goes there and he starts smacking them around. You know, no one's really threatened by them physically. And honestly, collectively, until they band together, which is also another theme, because that suggests that the structures that have kept them there can actually be overcome. And you start to wonder, you know, if they had done this earlier in their lives, if they had come together early, like what would happen? I think that's also the tragedy. Like, you know, Gaines is, like I said, he's very skillful. And some of the lessons or the observations that he makes, I mean, they're brutal. And what I mean by that is the characters, sure, you know, they're standing up, sure, they're accessing that masculinity and manhood, but there's this lingering sort of, you know, reality or thing underneath this that suggests that, you know, Why hadn't they done this before? This is how you overthrow this power,
So-
right? And you're doing it now.
So here's the question. Who's the enemy in this book? Who's the villain?
Time's the villain. I mean, in some way it's time. And I say that
is it just time?
Well, I'll parse that out for you, because I know that's like such a, a very vague thing to say, but I do think it's time, in that even though the men stand up, even though they do that, as Mape says, you wanted the change, you wanted this access, your time in the sun to do this, and it really is something, it's gone. Like, it's you've made an impact, it's important, but your youth is gone, all of that is gone. And so, and then time is also the villain to fix, because in a lot of ways, the world in which he grew up in is no more. So he can't access that power against those men. Then someone like Bo, he grew up expecting to behave like Fix, and he's dead.
Yeah.
For it.
Well, I mean, there's still, I can see that. I can agree with you that time. My thought of the villain is the system as a whole. And the reason I say that, Maria touches on it, as y'all see next week, but the reason I say that is Fix is part of the system just as much as the men are, just as much as what's his name, Marshall Hebert is. I mean, all three of them. You haven't got to this part yet, but look at what T-Jack says about Marshall Hebert when he's in the bar. And I think that Miss Merle says it earlier too, that he didn't want it, basically, right? That he didn't want any of this. And the only time you see him is he's drunk off his ass, right? Him and I forgot the woman's name, but they're drunk, not caring about anything, right? So they're the wealthy, right? They're the wealthy landowners who own that whole land. Then you have Fix, who's Cajun. These are the distinctions, of course, in South Louisiana that Maria is going to talk about a little bit. And Cajuns were viewed as less than white landowners, right? So Fix is being used by them, just like Bon is being used by, is it Marshall Hebert? Anyway, but whatever the white wealthy guy is in that one, Hebert thing, is used by him to keep, of course, Jim and Marcus in their place, and then here to keep the black men in their place, right? And then the black men are at the bottom. We don't have any free people of color here. We don't have anybody like Catherine Carmier or anything like that, which is a whole nother issue, even though we have the discussion, right?
Well, actually, they do have characters from.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
But we don't have that detailed exploration.
Right.
There are those moments in the cemetery where they're talking about, and I'm going to use the term Creole here in the way of mixed race individuals. Maria uses it in the historical term of people born of European descent in Louisiana. So that term has changed a little bit, but there are discussions, of course, of the families in the cemeteries with that, and that's what we're talking about here. But the thing is, fixes things for Marshall, right? I'm gonna go and read this because this is in T-Jack's bar, but he's talking to Luke Will and some of the other guys who y'all see too. He's talking about him. He says they did other little jobs to keep things running smoothly in the parish, like turning over black school buses, throwing a few snakes into black churches during prayer meetings, or running blacks out of what used to be all white motels and restaurants. Some people say they got paid as much for these little civic duties as they did at the dirt plant, where they had their actual jobs. So they're being used, right? And then remember too that Gil, which we need to ask if Gil is being selfish, as y'all get to that next part with him. This section where y'all ended, he stands up to Candy and says, because Candy's another person we need to talk about. She's that wealthy white landowner. He stands up to her and says, looking at us as if we're a breed below you. He's talking about him as a Cajun, but we're not, Candy. We're all made of the same bone, the same blood, the same skin. Your folks had a break, mine didn't. And some people point to that, and I point to that too, as him saying, you're treating us just like these men here, right? And you're using us. So I see time as the villain, but I also see the system that they're put into as the villain. Because Louisiana, as you know, has a very, I wouldn't say interesting, but Louisiana could have served as a good example of race relations. It just didn't.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I always go back to Thaddeus Davis's quote about that, which means I want the plantation too and surveillance, but that's one other issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's something, because the system is, yeah, obviously, I think it is the villain. But I also think there's something, and we should say what the system is, right?
Right.
So, and what is the system? What
So,
would you say the system is?
so for me, the system here, I mean, and in most of these texts would be white supremacy, and just the ways that whiteness constructs itself to maintain power, because this isn't slavery, right? But it's slavery, but it's the extension of slavery through these systems like sharecropping, which they talk about a little bit here, through the bond lease system, which the Love and Dust deals with. So it's the extension of that system and the convalescing of whiteness, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I see, and I'm trying to think if there are legal discussions here, but not really. So that's really kind of how I see that. But then even that's why I even think that Marshall Hebert is an interesting character too, because he's at the top of that system, yet he cares less about what's going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they're gonna come in and with T-Jack, and he's like, I don't want this,
Right.
you know. So now that I think about it more, it's showing the effects of this system that none of them started, right? I mean, this was started way before even these characters were born.
Mm-hmm.
Affects them, white, black, Cajun, whatever.
Yeah, but I think in thinking about it just in the context of white supremacy, it suggests that the way that you would solve it is for everyone to realize we're all the same. Yay.
Yeah.
And that's not, it's more complex than that, because the other system is capitalism.
Yeah.
And that's white supremacy plus capitalism for me equals that system. And the reason I say that is because you have these, Black men who can trace their lineage and ancestry to being capital. And so the ability to access personhood and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is to move out of that state of being capital. And the way that, and it's almost a little too passive for me to say, oh, they're all in the system and they're all affected by it, because the way that characters like Luke Will or Fix become white men like Marshall Hebert is to access capital. Now, historically, that means subdue the Blacks, make them do your work for free, exploit them. How is that different? And so it's, this behavior is almost, it's personal yet impersonal. It's like, oh, we're going to turn over these school buses. Oh, we're going to do that because this has material gains. If it was just to be spirited, you'd have psychopaths doing it and that's it. But you have active people who are probably decent and good doing it because there's material gains to be had, And I think sometimes when we talk about white supremacy and the systems of the South as if these are, not complicated, but oh, why can't we all just get along and love each other and appreciate each other's cultures? I'm not sure that's what it's about. Yeah.
I agree with you.
The way that people accessed power was to gain whiteness. And the way you accessed power and whiteness was to gain capital. And the way you gain capital was to cut other people off at the knees.
And you see that discussion.
People.
You see that discussion here.
Yeah, I mean, and that's basically what
the best land.
And so, Fix, his way of doing it is not passive because he's not quite white yet. Right. It's brutal. And the way that Marshall Hebert can afford to be like, oh, I don't want this. You have it already,
This gets into other discussions that I wanted to have too. I mean, going back real quick to Miss Merle, there are two things I want to say from her first. And one is, of course, her comment about Fix and the Cajuns. She says, I don't like him. Why we ever let that kind on this land, I don't know. The land has not, this isn't Miss Merle, this is Beatrice. This is Marshall's wife or significant other. I don't like him. Why we ever let that kind on this land, I don't know. The land has not been the same since they brought those tractors here. And of course, there's discussions from some of the characters about who gets the land. And then remember too, the land's important, and this is capital, because Mate says, I can't go out and fish on that land anymore either.
Right.
There's the chapter where Chimley's talking about him and Matt being out on the land and be like, we can only fish on this one spot. And Maeve says, they bought up all the land, I can't do it either. And that river and that land plays an important role in a lot of Gaines's works. I mean, even back to Catherine Cormier, as we know too. But the thing I wanted to talk about real quick or get your thoughts on, especially with the capital discussion, Candy and her continual, because Miss Merle points this out, and I think Miss Merle points this out. How does she refer to the men? And remember too, all those men aren't from the same plantation.
Right.
So there's discussions of that with Mapes. We could talk about surveillance too, but how does she refer? She refers to them as my people. And in this chapter, I have marked 1, 2, 3, 4, like 4 or 5 on one page where she says my people.
Yeah. I mean, I think that Candy is a very problematic character for me because she's simultaneously sympathetic. She obviously loves Matthew,
he raised her,
and yeah,
him and Miss Merle,
she's grateful, all of those things, and yet she's got to step out of the way for everything to move forward. Like she has to let those men do it. Like when there's that scene when she's talking to Mapes and she says, they're protecting me, they did it for me. And they're like, no, we didn't. Like, you can go home now. Like, we don't need you. And also the way that the other characters are dismissive of her own, her not even motivations, but her own machinations, meaning she's going to say that she did it, and then they're going to let her go if they even take her. They're not going to take her seriously. And so it's almost like she's kind of delusional about her own influence and power, not only over the men themselves, but over the system itself. Like, I'm a white lady, I can do something within it. And, you see Maeve saying, to Lou Dimes, like, get your girl in place. Like, you need to take control of her. I mean, you can see, like, she doesn't want to perform this traditional feminine, Southern femininity. She doesn't want to do that. And yet she also wants to sort of use it so that she can like help people. So in some ways, I'm not going to lie to you, when I was reading it, I was like, this character is also moving towards this weird area of irrelevancy too. Like or rather, she has to figure out, like the old men, like all the people on the plantation, like Gil, right? That character. Okay, your model for how to move through the world is its expiration date is here. So you need to figure out another plan.
Is she
That's the way I look at that character.
Is she the white liberal?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But she's also wrapped up in the wealthy elite too.
Well, she thinks she knows what's best,
right.
And she thinks she can do what these men are trying to do for themselves. Yeah.
Well, I found it interesting that you mentioned she's performing. She doesn't want to perform Southern femininity, yet she's banking on it. Because then I think of Miss Merle, because she's definitely performing Southern femininity, and she brings food to the people. She brings.
Well, I think Miss Merle is a much more. Well, there's something that older characters tend to have in text and old people in real life, and that's wisdom. That character
comes with age too.
Yeah, she has a little more wisdom than Candy does. I mean, I don't know. Like I said, the Miss Merle character seemed to. I don't know. It's not a deep character, but she seems to be moving through, the system. She's more adept at, moving through the system than Candy is. Candy is still bucking it and pushing against it, with the way she presents herself and with the way she interacts with all these different people. And so she's very ambivalent about her place in the system. Whereas Miss Merle she understands what her purpose is and how she can, help or not help. Whereas Candy, she doesn't know exactly what she's supposed to be doing. She knows, okay, I can do this, but I can't do this, and I don't want to do this. And honestly, it's not useful, not for her and not for the men there. Because I do think now, and we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but we could talk about it some more, is that, and that's why I said time is the enemy. All these people have been raised to move through the world in a very specific way, and that time is over. I think this text really, it's one of my favorite books in the Gaines universe, if you will, using that comical term.
The Gaines universe.
The Gaines universe, because Gaines wrote, like, I guess you could say out of order. Like, he didn't write chronologically, meaning he wrote books about the 1940s when during the 1990s. That was published in 1990s, and he was writing about the past. He wrote this, and I want to say in the late, in 80, yeah. And so this was his latest, if you will, book. And so this book is sort of like that reckoning of all the world that he built in his novels. It's like, okay, this is the same world that executed Jackson. This is the same world that Catherine and, I'm not Jackson, Jefferson. This is the same world that Jackson and Catherine couldn't be together in. This is the same world that Miss Jane Pittman aged to 100 something years old. Like, this is that same world. And the conclusion of that world is that what happens at the end of the book. And so the people who survived, right, that world and thrived even, in that world of Miss Jane Pittman or Catherine Cormier or whoever, and by the skin of their teeth, by their values and beliefs, they're not going to make it, or they're struggling by a gathering of old men. And that's everyone. So if you have not, it really reminds me about everything going on today. Like, who are we in this new world, right? We have to adjust, we have to adapt, but some of it is luck and some of it is foresight. And not everybody has the gift of foresight. And so you see these characters who, quite frankly, they're not prepared for a new world that's here already, right, in this text. So there's a part, I believe, where there's the Sheriff Guidry. He features in A Lesson Before Dying. I think it's the same sheriff, because Gaines does that. Like, Mapes is in Brady Sims and that kind of thing. And so
I was about to say, I think Brady Sims would be chronologically later, right?
Oh yeah, Brady Sims, yeah. And so you have this character who behaved one way in one book and then behaves this other way, or his features behave this other way in this other book. And so you have like this noting of the passage of time and the mores and ways of moving through the world and society. And so you sort of see that, okay, in this book and, in the context of this time period, this is how you're able to behave and it's successful. But as you go further down the line, you can't. So a character like Beau has to die. I mean, he has to, in this world that, in the world of A Gathering of Men, in a way that he would have been allowed to thrive and live and be successful in other books. I mean, think about it. How far away is Beau's behavior off of some of Sidney's behavior in Of Love and Dust?
I don't know. We don't get much of Beau.
Well, we know that Beau beat Charlie with a cane stick.
And we know that.
He was brutal with him.
Yeah.
And we know that in other texts, that brutality, right, is part of it. That's acceptable.
Well, I guess I'm thinking about Bonbon or Sidney Bonbon in The Love and Dust. I'm like, we know more about him. We see him internally. We see him humanized.
Mm-hmm.
I would say in many ways. But when you were talking too, I was thinking about tragedy. It's been a tragedy of Brady Sims. It's been a while because Mapes is in there too.
Mm-hmm.
But Mapes' connection with Brady Sims, I think, is really important. And I see that as a continuation here because Mapes knows that he's being pitted against the African-American man. He's being pitted and used, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's that discussion. And really kind of one thing that I just thought about that I think would be fascinating for class is to teach him chronologically with when the texts are done.
Mm-hmm.
Because he does create a Yoknapatawpha. I mean, he does create what Faulkner creates, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say is in depth, but he does it because he's repeating characters. He's using them again. I haven't thought about seeing them mature except for Mapes. That's the one I've really kind of thought about because he pops up in both those. But I'm thinking too about what is the resolution here? And like I said, they haven't got to the end part yet, but are even Gil and Cal a resolution?
Of course.
You know?
Well,
are they?
A hopeful possible resolution. In some ways, yes, because the fact that they even exist in the same space and it's integrated, that's the future, right? And yet who knows how that relationship will pan out, and the complications of that. But the fact that exists in that way, is a form of is a type of resolution. Now, I'm worried to say things are resolved because we know that life is long and things are ongoing. But, none of those characters in that text, Fix, the old black men, all the people on the plantation on down, Mapes himself, they were never afforded a world where a Gil and Cal's friendship is possible. And what I mean by that is, yeah, Mapes has relationships with these black men and he knows them. Yes, people intermingled, but when you are in school and on the same team with somebody, you're equals.
Well, that's what I was about to push back on you about a little bit, because that was really the question I wanted to get to. Is it almost seems like a discussion, because there's the mention of Jackie Robinson with the Brooklyn Dodgers, which I think is an important thing. And there's almost kind of the feel to me a little bit that the athletic field is the place for equality.
Right.
And is that the case? You and I have had a lot of discussions about sports and different things. Is that the case?
Well, it's not just the athletic field, but they're in school together.
Well, that's another thing we need to talk about too, but go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, now, is the school prejudiced or bigoted or racist?
What school is it?
It's LSU. Yep. I mean, is it those things? I don't know. But my brother has.
Are they still playing Neck at that time?
They were still playing what?
Neck, is that the song?
Whatever. I don't know. But I will say my brother said something really interesting. And it's because he went to a high school where the mascot was the Rebels. And he was like, when I would wear that jersey, I would be filled with anxiety because I'm representing. And and then that's what it was. It was based off the Confederacy. I mean, there's a lot of, the colors and when the school was founded and all of that. But he said, if I have this jersey on, it's still not the pure crack cocaine, it's like went to embody something that's meant to represent something else. And with it physically on my body, it just doesn't mean the same thing. So the LSU of Fix, the fantasy school that he's so excited that Gil gets to represent and go to, simply just doesn't exist if he's playing with Cal.
There's two things I just thought about too. And of course, like I said, things that we talked about before. I periodically, and I did it this year, looked up the SEC, of course, football teams, and then the number of, I think it's there's 75% black football and basketball, right?
Mm-hmm.
I looked up the number, of course, black students.
Mm-hmm.
9, maybe 12%, give or take. And most of those schools, the ones I looked at, UGA, LSU, Auburn, Alabama, give or take. That says a lot, education-wise. But the other thing about the education that he points out too, and crap, they haven't gotten to this part yet. This is stuff we're gonna talk with Maria. But anyways, we're going to say it. I mean, Fix tells him, he's like, I sent you to school because you're the one, you're chosen, yet you come back acting like this. Right?
I think that's actually a really good point, meaning, and that's what I meant. Like the LSU that he sent him to doesn't exist. Like the one he wanted to send him to, the one he couldn't go to, the one Huey Long was on the sidelines, playing with the band, that doesn't exist in this text. It's gone. And so, yeah, like he sent his son and he prepared his son to move through the world. And here it is. It's a new world. So, yeah, I absolutely, I think about that a lot with, while I was at, the institution where you and I attended grad school.
Lafayette.
Yeah. And I was there. I encountered so many students whose parents valued college and valued higher education, but the things that come with higher education and a college degree, they had anxiety about, meaning, oh, you're coming home with these new political beliefs, and oh, you're coming home talking about this, and oh, you're coming home saying that. And, I sent you're supposed to go to college to get a job. And it's like, well, also you go to college to get acculturated. You go to college to be socialized. And
which is what we should do in K-12 as well.
Exactly. Well, that's why you go to school. Okay. And so in a lot of people's eyes, oh, my parents didn't get to go to college, or they went to college in a very specific way. And then I go to this school, I have these new opportunities. And oh, these are the things that come with that. A lot of people are not prepared for that. And so Gil's story is an old story. It's the story of somebody going off to college. Like, I want my son to be a doctor, and he's a doctor, but he doesn't, right? He's alienated from you now.
But I'm not a medical doctor.
Right. But no, I mean, I think it's
Yeah.
true. You know, even in my family, it's like, okay, you've gotten this degree or degrees, I should say. And with every degree you get, you start to see the world differently. And I'm not going to say it's necessarily alienating, but it can be. But one of the things you get is this different understanding of the world that does separate you from people who valued what you got. But then when they see the reality of having that, it's not that neat. And so I think that's Gil's, you know, that's Gil's perspective in that.
And that brings up two things. I was looking up when Laura Hinton desegregated LSU's football team. It was the early 70s. He was the first Black player on LSU's football team. So about the same time, because this takes place in the late 70s, of course. But the other thing you were talking about too, that alienation reminds me of Lizette and Croussett's novel that they just read too, because even though it's different with that discussion, they view her as selling her out or betraying them, because she goes to basically New York and they're still in Miami, right?
Right.
So, and then that disconnect that arises because she can't think of the language to use when she comes home to talk about plagiarism, talk about the things that are going on. So it's that disconnect kind of in a different way than the political disconnect that Gil and Fix have. But the last thing we need to talk about, we have to talk about it because it's there, is my picture here, and you and I have both been there.
Yeah.
My background. Don't look at me like that. You know where that is.
Oh yeah, I know where it is.
Yeah. It took you a second to remember.
Yeah. I was like, why does he have a grave? Oh yeah, that. Yeah. I was like, why are you at a graveyard? And then yeah.
So the picture behind me is the graveyard where Gaines is buried now. And of course, I haven't been over there to see him. He passed away a couple of years ago, or actually last year, I guess, 2019.
2019, yeah. It's been a year and some change.
But, you know, this is why he wrote this graveyard right here. This is on the land where he grew up, the plantation where he grew up, where him and his wife bought land. And they preserved this cemetery. This is the cemetery that's in A Gathering of All Men, basically, where they go and they eat the pecans and visit the graves of the people that have gone before them. And as somebody points out, as one scholar, I think it's Patricia and Milton Rickles point out, that they're basically doing communion at the cemetery. They are having church at the cemetery, and the pecans are the Eucharist, essentially.
Yeah.
Because the bodies that are in the ground, of course, have populated it with the pecans and the trees. And there's a bunch of things in there that are important about the intermingling of people too, right? Think about, I think, Jacob Aguilar's sister, Creole sister, and all of these types of things. So it's a very sacred spot. And there's that line too, and I'm not gonna look it up right now, but the tractor is getting closer. And the tractor is coming up and burying it, and, you know, getting rid of all indication that they were here. That's what the cemetery represents for him. And I would say to a lot of people, the families of individuals who are buried back there, every year isn't on La Toussaint, I think that's the day, there's a cemetery beautification. That's the Sunday before All Saints Day, or the Saturday typically before All Saints Day is when they do it. There's a beautification where people come from all over the country and they clean the cemetery, and they play and they talk and they do everything, and then they go to his house to have food. And we were, you know, I guess, privileged enough to take part in that for multiple years. I was able to take my kids out there. But the first time I went out there, so Walter Zeno is buried out there. That's who he dedicates this to. That's the man that he came back to hear stories from, which Gaines is coming back to write. It's a whole nother story that I could tell you all about, and that Jennifer and I could tell you all about, that's important. We don't have time right now, but the first grave that I saw when I went back there the first time was Snookum.
Oh, wow.
Or at least I think maybe some semblance. I think it was Snookum. That was the sole marker on that grave. And some of the graves are buried in. Some of the graves have no names. His aunt who raised him has no name back there. But yeah, I don't know what you want to add to that, but can you whatever you.
It's striking me looking at the picture, because like you said, I've been there quite a few times. And when I'm looking at the picture, you can literally see how it's like this sacred space amidst the fields. Like you can see where when it says the tractors are coming closer and closer, you see the sugar cane in the background that's inching towards it. And when you go there, the feeling you have is like it's this almost
it's 1 acre.
It's 1 acre, and it's this natural temple,
Mhm.
right? And so it's surrounded by, like I said, the fields and the dirt roads and stuff, but it's just one little plot of land, acre of land, that has these, graves on it.
Mhm.
And it feels very sacred when you go there, and it definitely feels like a memorial. And I think a lot about the act of memorializing when I think about Gaines's work, because we have to show those videos whenever we worked at the Gaines Center, where he talks about in his own words why he wrote and what he was afraid of. Basically, and it says it in the Gathering of Old Men. It'll be like it's almost like we never lived. It's like they'll forget we ever was. And I think that's powerful.
I didn't mean to interrupt you real quick, but
Oh,
this
no,
is what
go ahead.
I'm looking at a piece that I wrote on his death, and I'll share this with you if you want it. But one of the things I found while working at the Gaines Center was a little notebook that he had. And I think this shows the notebook. Yeah, I wrote this at the center. This is the notebook he wrote. His handwriting is atrocious, by the way. But it's just a little flip notebook. And he wrote about the people that he encountered on the train and everything like this. But he wrote this, and this always stands out to me. This sums up what Jennifer was saying, what characters say in A Gathering of All Men. This was before he was famous. I think this was probably even before he published Catherine Carmier. I don't know exactly what date this was, but it was very early on. And he said, I write because I must, because there's something out there that needs to be said. If I don't say it, nobody else might not say it either. By this, I mean, who will write about my part of the country? Who will write about the way my people talk, the way they sing, the way they feel about God? And I always get goosebumps reading this one, but the way they work, their superstitions. There's so many things that can be said about this particular area. Money is not the objective, though I want to make money with my writing, but I want to get self-satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
And that sums up everything.
It does. I mean, you see the cemetery, you see the land, you read his works, you understand that this man had a purpose.
Right.
And he felt his purpose. And he felt, in some ways anointed by his talent. And it's not like any like fancy way of saying, oh, you should be doing this, but he was his community's storyteller.
Yeah.
That's what he did. And once his community changed and altered and almost faced extinction, he felt that need and that purpose to tell their stories. And in some ways, I like that idea of like, being anointed in that way. Like, okay, he's the one that can tell the stories. He had this purpose. It was almost, it's a great story in and of itself. It's a great narrative, but it's just the truth that, he had this experience and he felt that purpose.
And they singled him out as the one. I mean, he talked about that.
Well, what's so interesting because the lady that came, she's a lawyer, she came up with intersectionality. I think her name is Kimberly
Crenshaw.
She tells this story about being young, and her and her brother, her parents made them go to like church camp, and her brother said, we're not going, we're going to go get something to eat, and we're going to skip church camp. And then they got found out and they got punished. And she argued with her parents back and forth and said, I shouldn't be punished because you left me in the care of my brother and I had to do what he had to say. So I don't think I should be punished. And her dad was like, well, aren't you the little lawyer? And, she's like, that was an anointing, and I thought that was so interesting. It's like, this way of like finding your purpose early in life because of a skill you had, even at a young age, and you're allowed to develop that. And I think I like those stories. And I like the story about Gaines is because I think African Americans have a very specific and intense experience in this country. That we've explored. I mean, anybody that knows anything about the socioeconomic dynamics of this nation knows that. And I think it's also important that we tell stories about people who see things in children, see really real traits and things in children and encourage them. Like I told you many times, my mom handed me a book and that was all she wrote, and so I really like that story about Gaines having this skill and being a part of community, and that gave him his purpose and his journey in life. Just on like a just as like a personal narrative. It's just something that happened to a real person. And coming from where he came from, again, like I said, I grew up in this area. Obviously, I came along a good 40, 50 years, than when he would, or 40 years. I don't want to age the man too much, but I know what kind of things that he was up against to get that level of fame, and not just fame, just education. I mean, if that's the graveyard, imagine what the community looked like, right?
Yeah,
And
and we have.
so
Go ahead.
he came from, not a lot of economic advantages, but the communities love and support, and that opportunity and encouragement to develop his skills, carried him very far. So in some ways, just thinking about Gaines the man, and his journey and his path through life, I think can be really inspiring. And that's just something I see, like I said, when I look at that graveyard behind you.
And this is the last remaining cabin. This was a few years ago.
Oh, wow.
This would have been when he grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the quarters at River Lake. So one family lived on one side, one family lived on the other, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is actually the plantation. This is the big house. This is River Lake. The cemetery is right behind me. So this view right here, these are all pictures that I took. This view right here, I think I took this during the NEH. This view right here is the cemetery. This is right behind me. These are the sugarcane fields. Do not swallow sugarcane. Just chew it. You'll throw up if you do. I learned that the hard way. Anyways. But I think that we need to wrap up. I think that Gaines' story is important, and I can tell them that. Hopefully I can show them a video or do that. But one thing that I was just reminded of, as you were talking to, I've never thought of Gaines as being anointed, or anybody as being anointed in that way, but I think it's important to realize too that King served as one of Gaines' inspirations.
Mm-hmm.
Shares a birthday with King.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. You know who else he shares a birthday with too, don't you?
Mm-mm.
I thought you knew this.
Mm-mm.
So I kind of disavow this one a little bit for various reasons, but this makes me think about the discussions of, does the athletic field change things? It's Drew Brees.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty cool.
So King, Brees, and Gaines are born on the same day. And the reason I kind of disavow Brees a little bit, especially this year, is because, of course, the comments that he made, I think, last year, that he got blasted. I forgot exactly what they were, but his black teammates were blasting him and be like, you played with us for all these years, and yet you still haven't learned anything.
Right.
So
right.
That's partly why I asked, does athletics bring you together?
I mean, I think it's possible. I mean, Drew Brees is that's a whole nother podcast discussion. That's a whole nother thing. But I actually had that discussion with one of my students, because as you know, I'm in New Orleans. So I had that discussion with my students in reading a story by Danielle Evans, which was about, the South and all of that other good stuff. And, I think that it has the potential, like almost anything else. It has the potential. However, people still live and come up in a community and a society that is systemically imbalanced, and they bring that with them everywhere they go. And, for someone like Drew Brees, the hope or the idea is that, playing alongside Black men, consistently, repeatedly for your whole career, and having those intimate relationships would give you an insight into their lives and who they are as people and the complexity of that. But, the reality of the situation is football is a job.
Yeah,
it's a job. And the kind of conversations, and this reminds me of something I talked about with my sister, when these things were happening, right? When all this, when Kaepernick was kneeling, this summer that we've had with George Floyd, all this reckoning and controversy and all this other stuff, a lot of people were trying to reach out to other people to have hard conversations. And, the reality of the situation is you have to have a relationship first.
Yeah.
before you can have those hard conversations. You can't just reach out to somebody and say, hey, you're Black, or hey, you're white, I want to talk to you. Like, no. One of my students said that she was in the checkout line in New Orleans at the grocery store she worked at, and her white, the regulars would come in the grocery store and shoot the breeze with her in her checkout line. Now they wanted to talk about Breonna Taylor and tell her how, Breonna Taylor was partially responsible for her murder. And she's like, I said, number one, that's inappropriate. But number two, to have those hard conversations, you need to have a real relationship with a person. And because you need to get vulnerable and you need to go there. And, Drew Brees' comments, what that said to me was he may have played with these men. He may have partied with these men. He may have celebrated with these men. He may have even cried in defeat with these men, but he doesn't know them. And that's very, very sobering to think that you could be that close to people consistently for years and you don't know them. And I think that's something that, Gaines talks about, to bring it back to Gaines. And I believe the essay is Miss Jane and I. And he says, it's like, and that was in Mozart and Leadbelly, where, he said, someone asked me why I write. And he says, I write for the young Black people of the South, and then they were like, well, who else do you write for? Which is an interesting, pushback on that question. But he said, I also write to tell the white people of the South who their neighbor is. Basically, like, you share space with these people, you eat the same foods as these people, you are closely embedded and aligned with these people, but how much do you really know about each other? And I think that's kind of like the eternal question. How well do we know each other? And not in an adversarial way of like, oh, I know you're gonna do me wrong, or, discriminate against me, or not get along with me. But like, what is my life really like? How do you not know that a lot of Black people's grandparents served in the military? I don't understand that. That you just, what does it mean to be known and to know each other across these differences? That's basically what I was left with when I heard those comments. So
when you read Breeze's comments. Yeah. Well, on that note, I have to go, so we need to end.
Of course. Okay. Well, this was a great conversation.
Yes, it was. There was a lot to talk about, and a lot that they hopefully will get, but they may not get. So I may have to explain a little bit, especially about Gaines going and everywhere and everything like that. But that's stuff they need to know.
Yeah.
But I can tell them about that later. All right. Good to see you.
You too. Bye, Matt.